Welcome to the Manga Bay Newscast. It's November 25th, 2020, and I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Today we're taking a look at the importance of securing indigenous communities' land rights and the global push for privatization that can deprive those communities of access to their land. A study published in Nature Sustainability in 2018 found that indigenous peoples manage or have tenure rights over about 38 million square kilometers of land in 87 countries, more than a quarter of the world's land surface, and that those lands intersect about 40% of all terrestrial protected areas and ecologically intact landscapes. Another study published earlier this year in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment found that indigenous lands hold 36% or more of remaining intact forest landscapes. Both these studies are just part of the growing body of evidence showing that recognition of indigenous peoples' land rights is crucial to conservation. To discuss indigenous land rights and how they can help us meet conservation goals around the world, we welcome to the podcast Daisee Francour, a member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin in the United States and the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Communications for the NGO Cultural Survival. We also welcome onto the podcast Anuradha Mittal, the Executive Director of the Oakland Institute, a think tank based in California that recently released a report titled Driving Dispossession, the global push to unlock the economic potential of land. Mittal explains how governments and corporations the world over are pushing for land to be put into productive use as a means of economic development, and how that can dispossess indigenous and local communities of their land without regard for the myriad benefits their land has for indigenous cultures and livelihoods.
In the midst of a pandemic and a growing climate crisis, we are seeing that the governments, corporations, international financial institutions, instead of addressing the crisis that we are in, are wanting to exploit even more of our limited natural resources, such as land.
The global push to privatize land comes even as the conservation world is increasingly waking up to the importance of indigenous land rights in the fights to halt climate change. The studies I cited earlier are just two examples of the abundance of research that has reached similar conclusions about how effective indigenous communities are at stewarding the land. But for Daisee Francour, as a member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, discussing indigenous land rights is not just an academic exercise.
Our traditional way of introducing ourselves, I'd like to share that first in my language. So, Daisee Niyugyats, Anawal, Niwagi Dalotan, Aonaya de Aga, Niwaga Hunjonta. So basically, I just said, hello, my name is Daisee Francour. I am a member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and part of the Turtle Clan. And so I like to orient myself as identifying as with that first. And I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Communications at Cultural Survival, which is, an Indigenous-led organization, Indigenous rights organization, and nonprofit and NGO where we support Indigenous people's rights and Indigenous community self-determination, cultures, and political resilience since 1972.
What is the Oneida Nations history in regards to land tenure and rights, and how has that affected your people?
So the Oneida people, we are part of the Haudenosaunee, or otherwise, understood as the Iroquois Confederacy. We are one of 5 original nations, now 6, and our homelands are spread across upstate New York and Lower Canada. And in addition, we've had deep influence throughout the entire Northeast United States. While the Haudenosaunee, we continue to steward our traditional lands and territories, today, there's really a minuscule amount of those lands that are owned or recognized under Haudenosaunee stewardship. And that is through Indian reservations in the United States and treaty lands and reserves in Canada. And so much of our traditional land base, has been stolen, which has really forced many of our communities to relocate within our traditional territory or to relocate to neighboring communities and territories. And so for my people, the Oneidas, we split into 3 groups to really ensure our survival during the early 1800s. And so at that time, during the American Revolution War, there was a lot of land grabbing and forced selling of our lands to white colonists, really just an array of federal and state policies that also resulted in land loss and removal for the Oneida people. Actually, in 1839, the Oneida's traditional land base shrunk from about 6+ million acres to 4,500. And today, in 2020, those numbers are just into the lower double digits. So over time, it's dramatic. There's been a dramatic loss of land, recognized land and stewardship and land tenure for the Oneida people and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy at large. As I had mentioned, the Oneida's really split into three to ensure our cultural continuity and communal survival. A lot of Oneidas stayed in New York, in our traditional territory. Some pushed farther up into Canada, into Ontario. And some of us moved to Wisconsin. And so that's where my tribe is located, the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. And there in the 1800s, we made a treaty with the Menominee people, the Menominee Nation, Native Nation to Native Nation agreement that allowed us to relocate there with their permission and consent. And so this was done prior to Wisconsin's official statehood. Even when we did relocate to Wisconsin, or some of the Oneidas relocated there, we continued to face, oppression of different state policies that resulted in a second loss of land. Today, the Oneida Nations, they're still recovering from this land loss in New York, Canada, and Wisconsin. And for my nation in Wisconsin, we have what is called like a checkerboard reservation. So we have kind of the traditional boundaries of the reservation that was outlined, from the Menominee people. And then through some of those state policies and land loss, it started to become a checkerboard. So we have like the boundaries, and then we have some recognized land and some not. And so I guess in terms of how that affects us today, that directly impacts our sovereignty and our ability to be recognized by non-Indigenous peoples and stakeholders in one, just how we steward our land, how we govern our communities. It really impacts our identity and how that directly impacts cultural continuity and transmission of knowledge, as well as our identity. The health of land and the health of people, Indigenous peoples, is directly interdependent and connected.
Around the world, how much land is controlled by Indigenous peoples, and how much of that land do they actually have legal right to?
I think one thing I'd like to shift in terms of language is actually using terms like stewardship instead of control, right? Because control kind of alludes to this like dominance where there isn't, where reciprocity doesn't exist. And Indigenous people's lands and a relationship with their land supports reciprocity. And so in terms of stewardship, right, Indigenous people's stewardship at a global scale, I think there are some statistics out there. I think it's there is an inconsistency in the statistics because there is an inconsistent global recognition of Indigenous peoples, right? And in terms of identity, and I think that impacts the way that we look at these numbers globally. And so, but some kind of figures, I guess, that we could throw out there that we use here at CS is that, Indigenous peoples account for about 6.2% of the total global population, and that they manage or hold tenure over at least 25% of the world's land surface. And as a lot of people know and hear all the time, that equates to about 80% of the global biodiversity. And kind of talking a little bit about carbon sequestration, that includes that Indigenous peoples also manage at least 24% of the total carbon stored above ground in the world's tropical forests. And so when we think about Indigenous land tenure and stewardship, we're talking about all different kinds of landscapes and waterways.
You've touched on it a bit, perhaps, by mentioning the biodiversity and carbon sequestration on lands managed by Indigenous peoples. But why is it important for Indigenous communities to have decision-making powers over their land from a conservation perspective?
Indigenous people's lives, their livelihoods, their health, and their well-being are intrinsically tied to the health of land. And in order for Indigenous peoples to steward land, we have to have access to it. Right? Uninterrupted access, self-determined access, right? It's for us to determine what that access and relationship looks like. And so upholding kind of collective rights in relation to land is critical for Indigenous people's health, well-being, and livelihoods, our present and future. And I think what needs to be understood for non-Indigenous peoples and allies and, civil society is to recognize that Indigenous peoples we have a, what would you say, original instructions that were given to us by our Creator, and it's reflected in our religions and our cosmovisions and our creation stories. And there, from our beginning of our existence, lays out our relationship to a certain land base. And in those stories and in those instructions, it talks about our responsibility to the land, how we take care of the land, what is our role and relationship to the land. And I think, those things, they're embedded in every part of our culture. It's embedded in our ceremonies. It's embedded in our songs. It's embedded, in our language, just even in how, our words, like what they mean, right? I think like in the English language, the English language violence is embedded in the English language, and it's very extractive. And our Indigenous languages paint a beautiful picture and a story, even just for one word. And even in that breakdown, they start to really, it lays out, how would you say, like it would lay out a map, or it lays out a set of rules or responsibilities of how we're supposed to take care of the land, which in turn is how we take care of our people. And because, we are also forced to live and operate in two worlds, in this, I wouldn't even say post-colonial era, we're still very much in a colonial state. And we are forced to find the happy middle ground of where we still uphold our traditional ways of being and knowing and our responsibilities to the land, and navigate these colonial foreign structures, right? And that includes of ownership, of kind of just this transactional relationship with the land. And so we have to navigate those systems so that our traditional systems not only can be recognized, but implemented, right? So that we can implement our traditional ways of knowing and being. I think that's like the foundation that needs to be understood and for why Indigenous land rights are important, because it really impacts our livelihoods, present and future.
In Cultural Survival's work with Indigenous groups around the world, have you found any prevailing attitudes or trends towards land ownership and rights? For instance, are there a lot of Indigenous communities without legal rights to their land pushing for collective ownership, or are there other forms of ownership communities are pushing for?
Yeah, so I kind of want to just go back to, the correlation that I had shared about Indigenous land tenure and Indigenous governance. And so Indigenous governance is really, and this is really across peoples and cultures, is really designed to support the health, well-being, and livelihoods of the collective, right? So that's both like humans and non-human relatives within our communities and our territories. And so recognizing that, that is, I wouldn't say the gold standard or the go-to, but that is common across cultures and peoples is the collective, right? So when you talk about Indigenous rights, that is supporting collective rights, whereas human rights is supporting individual rights. And so again, it's reinforcing the collective and the response and that people in our communities, we all have a place and a role, and we have responsibilities. And so at CS, what we, in terms of our relationship to supporting Indigenous land rights, is really advocating for self-determination and free, prior, and informed consent in any decisions made about land rights and our kind of connection and position to that. And so if a community has a certain strategy or, whatever that is, we honor that. We honor their self-determination to pursuing that. And so when other, say, outside influences kind of come into play, that's where free prior informed consent, FPIC, becomes a part of that conversation, right? Of like how they're working with these outside forces to pursue kind of their land tenure. And so I think that there's like no one way of doing this, right? Every country that Indigenous communities are in, there's a different history. There's a varying history of colonization and what those kind of present day implications are. And so that really impacts the way Indigenous peoples mobilize and organize to secure their land rights. And so at CS, we do it through a handful of ways and kind of elevating that. And it's really done mostly through our grant making, through our Keepers of the Earth Fund, where we make grants directly to Indigenous communities who are working on their land rights. We also do it through our advocacy program and really shining a light on what folks are doing and connecting those stories really across the globe. And so in our experience, we've seen really a multitude of the ways that communities seek their land rights. And so if you don't mind, I can share a few of those examples with you.
Yes, please.
So some things that we've saw is kind of the initial step to securing land rights or pursuing land rights starts with like mapping, right? So oftentimes that can be like a community-wide participatory process where it really involves, elders to help document the communal understanding of where those traditional boundaries lie. And that includes, documenting existing oral knowledge and combining that with new technologies, like GPS, so that understanding of community land tenure and territories is understood and recognized by Western science and governments. And so in addition to kind of gathering all this information, having it really be a bottom-up process for communities, it also combines other information available about those lands, right? Like what those lands have been used for traditionally, like different, whether it be agriculture, fishing, trapping, hunting, ceremony, kind of really breaking down the different activities or purposes, right, that different parts of that land and territories have been used for traditionally. And in contemporary times. Another kind of approach that some of our partners have used in their pursuit to securing land rights has also been physically, occupying and monitoring their lands, even if those lands aren't recognized by those governments under their stewardship. So this work, though, is really dangerous, and it really leads to a lot of Indigenous human rights defenders being murdered or attacked and assaulted. But again, we're seeing this kind of increasing approach and embrace of new technologies to help kind of also even document those human rights violations through, just drones and different mobile applications. And a couple other examples for communities who are securing their land rights also include, taking advantage of different existing but minimally used legal pathways for land titling. Sometimes a lot of Indigenous communities aren't really connected or oriented with the process. They don't have lawyers, they don't understand the process. The process is not outlined in their Indigenous language, so there's a language barrier. There's a lack of access to education. All of these different barriers impact Indigenous people's access to kind of pursue Indigenous land rights or in their land tenure through these legal mechanisms. But we've seen some really awesome examples where Indigenous peoples have used different legal systems in their country both like in Chile and in the Philippines. One of our partners that we support is the Coalition Against Land Grabbing, which is in the Philippines and has done incredible things to secure land rights and recognition of their land tenure. And I guess there's like two final examples that I see happen a lot for not just with our partners, but across the globe is, really holding their governments accountable. Once those land titles are granted and secured, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done after that legal process to get those land rights secured. And so one thing that we've done at CS is support some international litigation at the Inter-American Commission Court. And I think that's what's really important, that what we've recognized at CS is the value of international pressure that comes with shining a light on land rights issues, right? Especially within the UN mechanism. It's so important because oftentimes, like, Indigenous peoples don't have the opportunity to really convey their issues to state governments, or they're suppressed, or there's a lot of threats to their livelihoods in doing so. And so taking it kind of notch up to shine that light at a global scale through UN mechanisms has proven to be very successful for a lot of Indigenous communities.
There's a big push by governments and corporations around the world to privatize land in the name of unlocking its economic potential. The argument is essentially that having the land as an asset gives the private owner access to credit, which in turn will lead to greater economic development and hence human prosperity. What would Cultural Survival's response be to this push towards privatization and the argument that it's imperative to unlock land's economic potential?
I want to unpack that question just a little bit. I think, economic development doesn't necessarily equate greater human prosperity. I think within a Western capitalistic framework, yes, that is one of the few ways or pathways to survive and even thrive in this extractive model. But those indicators are different. There are different indicators for well-being and positive livelihoods for a Western capitalistic worldview and an Indigenous self-determined worldview. And just economic development in itself is really predicated on the extraction of land and oftentimes, forced free labor of Indigenous peoples as well. And so in terms of, CS's view on privatization of land, I think what is really central to Indigenous or to Cultural Survival's approach to supporting land rights and securing land tenure, again, is really outlined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and Indigenous Peoples' Rights, and how specifically self-determination and free prior and informed consent plays a role in that process. And so I would say, CS, along with other organizations or whoever that may be, we don't have the moral, ethical, or spiritual authority to decide how Indigenous peoples choose to govern their lands and territories. And so rather, our role is to empower those Indigenous communities to ensure that they have the resources and support to self-determine their own livelihoods and futures. So if that means, that an Indigenous community wants to, kind of navigate this Western capitalistic model of land ownership through privatization, that is their choice, and at the end of the day, we're going to support their self-determination. And I think different Indigenous communities would go down that path for different reasons. And I think their kind of socio-political, economic situation that they're in, right, their environment, really, at the state level, at the country level, plays a big role in that. For example, in the United States, the Bureau of Indian Affairs and different federal policies has been designed, to really eradicate Native Americans here. And so it's then resulted in extreme challenges for Native Americans to one, be recognized for their existence and their history to be recognized. Nonetheless, their traditional territories and their present day rights and access to land. And so, because of that, of that history and those challenges in the United States, a lot of tribes aren't recognized, and so it doesn't mean that the relationship with the land discontinues. They just are coming up with incredibly innovative ways to having access to their land to steward their territories. And one of those examples is through land trusts, right? So using kind of the nonprofit model or even the LLC, right? A for-profit business, to creating these different institutions to secure their traditional lands. That's been kind of one approach. And so that, again, at CS, we support Indigenous people's self-determination and their environment, surrounding them, especially within their countries, really plays a role in their strategies and how they mobilize to secure those lands.
The Driving Dispossession report released earlier this year by the Oakland Institute finds that there is an unprecedented wave of privatization of natural resources underway around the globe. The report includes 6 case studies in Brazil, Myanmar, Papua New Guinea, Sri Lanka, Ukraine, and Zambia that document the ways governments, sometimes at the behest of international financial institutions or Western donor agencies, are pushing for more land to be put to what they call productive use in the name of economic development. Anuradha Mittal, executive director of the Oakland Institute, says of the impetus for the report,
in the midst of a pandemic and a growing climate crisis, as an independent policy think tank, Oakland Institute has been following the trend of what has come to be known as land grabbing. And with this crisis, we are seeing that the governments, corporations, international financial institutions, instead of addressing the crisis that we are in, are wanting to exploit even more of our limited natural resources, such as land. And the euphemism that is being used is one of putting the land to productive use or unlocking its economic potential for economic progress or so-called development. So we have been following this trend, and now seeing this big push for it was the impetus for doing this report, that in the midst of this crisis, and as climate crisis worsens, the economies are shattered with the pandemic, and the solution that is being offered is one of which is going to drive dispossession, which is one of privatizing land even more.
Can you tell us a little bit about the report's key findings regarding this push to privatize land all over the world?
Well, first of all, we are seeing that to attract private investment, governments are marketing hundreds of millions of hectares of land, calling it being available without consideration of those whose livelihoods depend upon it. The second thing, which majority of people might not realize, is that the major part of the land on the planet is still not controlled by private interest. As much as 65% of the world's land area is stewarded by communities under customary systems. So whether it is on legally recognized public land or customary land, billions of people rely on communally managed natural resources for their livelihoods. And for most of the humanity, land is a common good, which is valued as an ancestral asset, which has significant social, cultural, meanings and ceremonies. The other big finding of a report, I would say, which many of us might be aware of, is that the local communities and indigenous groups are the stewards of these resources, and they are in the front line in the struggle against land grabbing and destructive practices. So this resistance, unfortunately, is viewed by business and even by governments as an obstacle to investment in business. And therefore, governments are being encouraged to adopt the Western capitalist notion of private land ownership. So this includes creating of land markets so that land can be leased or sold and put into so-called productive use to unlock its value. We also identify some of the key drivers of this trend, including among them World Bank, which is a key actor in the push to privatize and commodify land. In 2017, its Enabling the Business of Agriculture report prescribed policy measures to governments to enhance what they call the productivity of land use and to encourage agribusiness expansion.
So a lot of indigenous peoples' customary lands are being caught up in this push for privatization. Are we talking lands to which indigenous communities already have legal rights, or is it more in instances where communities have traditionally lived on the land, but the government has never before recognized their rights to it?
Well, that's a very interesting question because, on one hand, the report looks at case studies around the world, and I can mention a few of them. But it's important just how we think of traditional versus legal. So the Western notion of this private ownership has certainly, been deemed as being legal, whereas customary ownership, which has been legal in its own ways, because it is not following the Western capitalist model, we tend to think of it as traditional. So I think it is very important to understand that around the world, again, the land has been administered for centuries. And suddenly we have this Western private ownership of land being upheld as the legal and the way of doing things. So definitely, to answer your question, we are seeing attacks on these communal ownership of land around the world. Let me give you a few examples. In 2018, for instance, Myanmar, the government made amendments to the country's vacant, fallow, and virgin land law. Now, these are lands which are not vacant. If you look at some of the indigenous ethnic groups in the country, from Karen to Kachin, Shan, Chin, Karenni, Mon communities, they have used these lands for centuries. Their ancestors have used these lands, but now they were faced with a stark choice that they had to apply for a 30-year permit to continue using the land, or else the land would have been made available for agriculture, mining, and other purposes. So they were faced with this choice. The land that they have lived on forever, they have to apply for a permit for 30 years, and that's it. Also, it completely ignored the ability of hundreds of thousands of displaced people, such as the Rohingya, because they were not in the country to be able to apply for this permit, and the lands where they have lived are now being made available for palm oil plantations, for mining, and other purposes. Similarly, in Brazil, we have the case of Bolsonaro, who used a pro-business, anti-indigenous rhetoric to garner public support for seizing indigenous land. He assumed office in January 2019 after a campaign in which he promised to expand the exploitation of the Amazon, halt the demarcation of indigenous lands, and arm ranchers to allow the takeover of lands for cattle ranching. Some of his attempts have been blocked by Congress, but he has succeeded in emboldening politicians and citizens alike, resulting in increased land invasions, killings, and violence of the indigenous and land rights activists. At the same time, acceleration of the deforestation. We cannot forget that it was in 2019 when the ranchers set large portions of the Amazon on fire, threatening a multitude of indigenous communities and the ecosystems on which they rely. Similarly, the report also looks at the case of Papua New Guinea, it looks at Sri Lanka, it looks at Zambia, especially Papua New Guinea and Zambia, which have had customary land rights, and how they're being threatened by this force of driving customary lands out, but instead replace it with privatization of land and creating land markets.
Who is generally the recipient of the private title to these newly privatized lands? Are there cases where the local indigenous communities are granted these titles, or is it more generally a private individual or corporation or other business-friendly entity?
That's another good question. When you talk about privatization of land titles, when we look at cases around the world, this is not being done to hand over the titles in a more secure form to the communities who have been living on these lands, as I said before, for a long time, using these lands for their livelihoods, for their cultural, and more important, protecting these lands. So, for instance, let's take the case of Papua New Guinea. In Papua New Guinea, nearly 97% of the country is under customary land tenure. But the government is making available millions of hectares of land for palm oil, mining, and timber operations, using the euphemism that it is unlocking the economic value of land. So these lands are not being given to the communities who have protected them, who have preserved them, who have depended on them for their livelihoods, but they're being made available to foreign corporations. In fact, in Papua New Guinea, the country's most recent development plan aims to move 20% of all land into a formal market by 2022. And if you look at the evidence from the last 4 decades, it clearly shows that the takeover of customary land for exploitation of natural resources has only led to deforestation and environmental degradation. It has led to destruction of livelihoods. It has caused conflicts within and between communities. So you are seeing transfer of lands from communities, often indigenous communities, to foreign corporations, logging firms, mining firms, resulting in no net benefit to the national economy or the communities, but basically a new kind of extractive economy which benefits multinational corporations.
What is the difference between customary and communal ownership and some of these other terms that we're using here, like traditional tenure and things like that? That seems like important to be clear on to understand the nuances of this issue.
That's, again, an important question when we talk about customary tenure, or we talk about the commons, or we talk about communal lands. It basically means that these lands are under common ownership of a community. And this responsibility comes not just with ownership, but a huge responsibility of preserving and taking care of these lands. So it is not up to an individual to say, I'm going to get out of farming, I'm going to just sell this millions of hectares or hundreds of hectares or even 60, 70 hectares of land to a private corporation or another individual. This is joint ownership. And that is why when I talk about these areas have been protected, it is because of that communal ownership. One might say that these are not legal titles. Yes, in the Western, say in the United States, we might not have the concept of the commons, or we might not have the concept of communal ownership. But in societies, whether it is Zambia or Papua New Guinea, communities have had that governance structures which entitle the communities to use those areas for their livelihoods, but more important, to also protect those areas. And it was not left up to an individual to sell them or destroy them or give them away to, say, an extractive industry. What is happening now is that, as I mentioned, that these communities are in the forefront of the struggle for land rights. The governments of these countries are being told that you have to unlock the economic potential of your land. So they are being urged through different measures to create land markets, to privatize land, to make themselves attractive to foreign investors. And that means making the lands available and to change the systems that have governed land in the countries. And this goes from, whether you're talking about Zambia or whether you're talking about Papua New Guinea. I mentioned Zambia because it is a very interesting country, because at the time of independence in 1964, there was no private land in Zambia. 94% of the country was under customary tenure, which I explained. It was managed by communities, and the remaining 6% was under state control. And that started to change in 1990s when the World Bank and the IMF required the government to change land laws towards privatization as a condition for restructuring its international debt. So as a result, Zambia saw a drastic reduction of customary land from 94%, and today it is less than 60% today. So this has shifted the control over land from people to the government, and which has then made the land available for exploitation by private interests.
It seems like there are a lot of benefits that indigenous people get from their land that simply can't be accounted for by solely viewing it in terms of the economy.
Well, definitely. And unfortunately, it is explaining economics as, the economy which is only led by multinational corporations, which is based on extractive nature and exploitation of natural resources, which is based on, taking the natural resources from a country to, and they're registered in tax havens where they give nothing back to the national economy. And unfortunately, that is seen as an economic investment. It is completely inside out, upside down economy. We are talking about systems where people on the land depend on this land for their livelihoods. We're talking about forests where indigenous communities depend on the minor forest produce for their medicines, for their cultural ceremonies, for their livelihoods. And you're uprooting all of that to convert this asset which has belonged to communities for centuries and turning it into just forestry area to be mined, to be exploited. And you're doing it in the midst of a worsening climate crisis. So instead of protecting our natural resources, when we see what's happening with the climate, we are bent upon destroying it further, only so that a few corporations can profit while the people and planet hurt.
The report particularly calls out the theories of Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto, who is often cited to justify private land titling. Can you tell us a little bit about what his views are on this subject and what you think they miss or what they're lacking?
Well, as you mentioned, De Soto's theory is that land by itself idle is not contributing. So to unlock its economic potential, you have to make it something which is marketable, which can be sold and bought and flipped around, where traditional indigenous rights are not recognized to the land, where the governments control it to make it accessible to foreign corporations. More important, make it easy and attractive for corporations to access that land, and that would spur growth, that would spur economic development, and that it would be a trickle-down phenomena where everyone in the country will benefit. However, and by the way, I should say it is this thinking which has been pushed by institutions such as the World Bank, the United States government, and its agencies such as the MCC.
That's the Millennium Challenge Corporation, an independent U.S. government foreign aid agency.
And so you have a situation where countries around the world are talking about, huge availability of land. The government of Democratic Republic of Congo, for instance, is advertising 80 million hectares of arable land. Madagascar claims that it has 30 million hectares of agricultural land and that only 10% of it is being used. Basically, the rest is available for foreign investors. In Ethiopia, over 3 million hectares of land has been made available for investment, so-called investment, which has led to hundreds of thousands of ethnic groups, indigenous groups being marginalized, facing police repression, human rights abuses, widespread hunger. In Nigeria, the country boasts availability of arable land across the country. In Peru, the government says that 8 million hectares of land are available with potential for agricultural crops and 18 million for pastures. Nicaragua is offering 7 million hectares of land, which is 60% of the country, for mining. However, research clearly shows that private titling does not increase access to credit and loans. So the claim that private titles will offer tenure security while customary systems are insecure and there's no evidence to corroborate that. In fact, we see that the process of transitioning locally developed customary systems in many cases offer tenure security into private title land will actually result in considerable social and economic displacement while placing ecosystems at work. So we have done enough research, and there is research from other institutions, which shows that when we move land from traditional systems into these private titles, it's a net loss from environment to economy. Research has also shown that the value of customary systems, for instance, it's kind of unfortunate that the Western aid agencies and international financial institutions have failed to recognize the evidence, and they continue to advocate and support the privatization of land, creation of land markets.
So are there any particular reforms you're calling for? Is there any way titling can happen while protecting indigenous rights to the land and its value as a resource in supporting livelihoods?
Well, first of all, I think we need to be aware that amidst the pandemic, as countries are hit by the crisis and they face economic hardship, the power of international financial institutions has grown. So in the report, we mentioned the case of Ukraine, where IMF, leveraging Ukraine's desperate economic situation, created a land market, which shows how this crisis is being used to advance the privatization of the commons. So first of all, we need to understand and accept that we cannot afford any more structural adjustment programs that ignore the stakes of the climate crisis and they move us in the wrong direction, while people are losing their livelihoods to add more stress to it. So the crisis has to be used as a catalyst to address the systemic issues which surround the overexploitation of natural resources, which has brought us to this, verge of this climate crisis where we find ourselves. So we understand that returning to normal is not an option, but there is another path forward. Indigenous lands and waters represent 80% of the world's biodiversity. And there is growing understanding and knowledge that local and indigenous communities are effective stewards of these areas. They stand as the final line of defense against land grabbing and destructive practices of governments and corporations, which are converting our family farms, grasslands, forests into monocrop industrial plantations, large ranches, or stripped earth mine. So we need to join these struggles against the commodification of land. You talk about titling. I mean, Nicaragua is an excellent case where the government had to do the demarcation of lands and do land titling of the indigenous lands. And these are communal land titles. The problem, however, is still of that of saneamiento, which is the individuals and corporations who are in these indigenous lands without the permission of the indigenous communities and Afro-descendant communities should be asked to leave by the government. They should be cleared of these lands. So the government has not fulfilled that promise. And we find another instance where the government is doing well by the doing business rankings of the World Bank, where it is seen as a big friend of the mining corporations and logging companies. So it is not enough to just do land titles, and these land titles have to be the communal land titles as the indigenous communities fought for. But it is really the implementation of those titles and respect of indigenous land rights. That is the most important thing that we are calling for.
If you enjoy the Mongabay newscast, we ask that you please help spread the word by telling a friend. That's the best way to help expand our reach and keep the show growing. If you have a friend who is particularly interested in indigenous rights and land tenure issues, why not share this episode with them? It'll be right up their alley. Another way you can help is by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet, so just $1 or more per month would really help us offset production costs and hosting fees. Supporters at the $10 a month level even get access to our members-only insider content. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, please head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay newscast. That's patreon.com/Mongabay. And don't forget, you and your friend can subscribe to the Mongabay newscast on the Google Podcasts app, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Pandora, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Or you can download our new app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all our previous episodes. And of course, you can read all of our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/Mongabay or on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle is @Mongabay on both those platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Mongabay newscast. I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, signing off. Talk to you again in 2 weeks.